Good afternoon and welcome to the Earth Institute's Postdoctoral Fellows Symposium. This is a symposium that we have each semester to showcase the works of the postdocs supported by the Earth Institute. These are a group of people who are selected through an international competition, supported in part by the Earth Institute and in part by a mentor or a school or a group. And what we try to do every semester is bring to you presentations on their work. Oh, my name's John Motta. I'm on the faculty of the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences and at the School of International Public Affairs. And I'm on the faculty of the Earth Institute, and I direct the Postdoctoral Fellows program. So I'm not going to say very much. I may say a little at the end, but what we would like is to have questions after each speaker, but we will reserve time at the end in case you think of a question that you didn't ask right after the speaker spoke. I'll try to do that. So first I'd like to introduce Weston Anderson, who will speak on El Niño Southern Oscillation and global food production.
So I am going to be talking about the El Niño Southern Oscillation and global food production, or another way of phrasing the topic is climate-forced crop production variability and the implications for synchronous crop failures. So this is work that I've done with my co-authors, Richard Seeger, Walter Baithkin, Mark Kane, and Liang C. Yu. And before I get into talking specifically about the topic, just a quick outline, I want to address three main questions in this talk. So I basically want to cover why is ENSO, or the El Niño Southern Oscillation, unique as a risk to global food production? Which are the teleconnections that are relevant from agriculture? And by teleconnections, I mean the remote influences on precipitation and temperature that are relevant for crop growing seasons. And how important is ENSO relative to everything else that causes crop yield variability? So that's pests, disease, random weather, anything else you can think about. So as a means of background, I just want to cover a little bit on how our global food production system has been changing in the last, call it 50 years, because this is relevant to how we're thinking about global scale risks. Since the Green Revolution, there's been a dramatic increase in the number of people that have access to an adequate number of calories. So this is showing how many people live in countries where they have inadequate access to the minimum daily caloric requirements. But these calories aren't produced within the same country. So increasingly, countries aren't self-sufficient in their population providing access to those calories. And that's just another way of saying that increasingly there are more people than ever before living in countries that are dependent on imports to meet their daily minimum caloric needs. And all that is to say that we live now in a global food production system more so than ever before. Production and consumption aren't only local, at least not for a large number of people on the earth. And so that brings us to how we think about, that affects how we think about the El Niño Southern Oscillation and its implications for global food security. So here, what I'm animating are tropical Pacific sea surface temperatures. And when I'm talking about the El Niño Southern Oscillation, this is a coupled ocean-atmosphere phenomenon where the warm phase, El Niño, is when eastern tropical Pacific sea surface temperatures are warm, and the cool phase, or La Niña, is when eastern tropical sea surface temperatures are cool. And for a long time in the climate community, we've known that the El Niño Southern Oscillation can have global scale effects on temperature and precipitation. So here's a figure from Horrell and Wallace in the early 80s showing these orange dots are where they looked at weather stations to measure tropospheric, tropical tropospheric stabilization. So during an El Niño event with warm tropical Pacific sea surface temperatures, you stabilize your tropical troposphere, which makes it more difficult to break the threshold for convection, so you get less precipitation and more drought throughout the tropics. And in addition to that, when you have sea surface temperature heating in the tropical Pacific, you tend to affect your atmospheric column, and you get divergence, which causes atmospheric waves that propagate into the extratropics and affect temperature and precipitation in the extratropics. So these modify your jet stream and change where it's going to rain and what temperatures tend to be. And so this is all to say just that ENSO has a global influence. So the reason that ENSO is unique as a risk to global food security is because it has a globally coherent effect on climate during the growing season. And this is important because traditionally neoliberal policies of agricultural trade liberalization have been pushed under the assumption that if you pool your risk, then crop failures in the US are independent from Southeast South America and China and Australia, and the global footprint of ENSO calls that into question. But to ask a little more strongly if that's actually true and to what extent, what's the structure of this risk, we're going to look at some of these specific teleconnections. So here, and for the rest of the presentation, I'm just going to present results for corn or maize, because just for the sake of time, but generally we did this analysis for maize, wheat, and soybean. So when we're looking at what is the structure of the risks that ENSO poses to global food security, we sort of took the analysis in 3 stages. So first, we're identifying major crop growing regions and seasons, because we want to identify where we are looking for the stress and when local crop flowering is, because crop flowering is when crops are most vulnerable to these climate stresses. Then we want to look in observations, so look at the large-scale atmospheric circulation during those times, so pinning down how ENSO is affecting these global-scale circulations. And then we want to isolate which components of those are due to random variability and which are actually forced by ENSO. And finally, we're going to map out measures of heat and moisture stress that are relevant to crops to look at how this risk carries through not only to large-scale circulations, but also to things like soil moisture. So the agriculturally relevant metrics of heat and moisture stress that we're going to use are killing degree days, which is a measure of extreme temperatures that a crop experiences during crop flowering season, or in the season that we approximate as crop flowering. And this is just maximum temperatures that become damaging to the crop, either because respiration outpaces photosynthesis, so you damage your final yields, or because temperatures are so extreme that you're actually doing physical damage to the crop cells. And we're going to look at soil water content, which is essentially a measure of soil moisture that accounts for differing stages of the crop season and accounting for additional evapotranspiration at some stages. To estimate whether these teleconnections are forced or just a matter of chance in a small number of events that we have in the observations, we're going to use an ensemble of atmospheric models. And the idea is that if you force all of these atmospheric models with tropical sea surface temperatures, or in this case this is global boundary conditions, what you get is a series of runs that have a single force component that's common between them, that's the response to ENSO. And if these atmospheric ensemble, if the response looks similar to observations, then we've got a little bit of confidence that what we're seeing in observations isn't due to random variability, but is instead a forced response to these tropical Pacific heating. So what I'm showing here is on the left observations, and on the right the AMIP multi-model ensemble mean. And this is the temperature on the bottom row, or moisture stress on the top row, response during local crop flowering seasons. So by local crop flowering seasons, in the northern hemisphere this is going to be boreal summer for maize, and in the southern hemisphere this is going to be austral summer. And what this should, the 2 takeaways from these figures are, first of all, that the observations look very much like the multi-model mean, which means that what we're seeing in observations is a forced response to ENSO. This isn't just random mid-latitude weather. And the second is that there's a real structure in the risk here. All that's being colored is major maize producing regions. So for example, southeastern South America and the US are 2 major maize producing players globally, and both of them experience hot, dry conditions during La Nina, which indicates that there's some degree of a correlated risk there, and that might be offset by relatively good growing conditions in the North China Plain, in southwestern Mexico, and northeast Brazil, but this is the sort of structure of a risk that we haven't entirely thought through as we've moved to an increasingly global food production system. Now, that's just restating that ENSO can force correlated risks, but what that analysis can't answer is how important are these? So these are risks to agriculture, but it doesn't quantify how important are those risks relative to everything else that can happen over the course of a crop growing season. To do that, we look at subnational crop yield statistics directly. So we're taking subnational statistics from the US and Mexico, Canada, Brazil, Argentina, Australia, China, and India, and then using FAO data at a country scale elsewhere, and we're directly comparing it to sea surface temperature variability to pull out how those two co-vary, which is a way of pulling out teleconnections to say how do these tropical sea surface temperatures via these atmospheric teleconnections affect crop yields. And the reason that's important is because we can then produce a time series like what we see on the far right, where you've got a single time series for total crop yield anomalies, and you have another time series for the ENSO forced crop yield anomalies. And what that lets you do is estimate the relative importance of those ENSO forced crop yield anomalies compared to the total anomalies. So you can do that for any number of regions, and what I'm plotting in each of these bars is the relative variance accounted for by ENSO relative to total crop yield anomalies. So for example, northeast Brazil, ENSO accounts for about a third of the maize production variance. So it's got a relatively strong influence on maize in northeast Brazil and in southeastern Africa. And generally these numbers fall sort of between 10 and 30%, which indicates that ENSO is a very significant player in maize variability, both regionally and globally. It's about 18%. And so comparing these variance estimates to total variability can give you an indication of how important ENSO is in the region. But I motivated all of this not by talking about total crop yield variability, but talking about the global scale of ENSO. And so what we really care about is synchronous crop failures. And that's this idea that you can have a single forcing that causes crop production failures in multiple regions simultaneously. And recently there was an analysis by Merabi and Ramankudi that looked at, in the historical record, when do you get the largest synchronous crop failures? So they're using observed historical yield values and looking at the fraction of global area covered by negative crop production anomalies simultaneously. And without a doubt, you see that maize in 1983 is the largest synchronous crop failure on record. And so we can look at those. This is the crop production anomalies in maize, and it's washed out here, but there are negative production anomalies in the US and northeast Brazil, in West Africa and southeastern Africa, with relatively good production in India and the North China Plain. Now, 1983 began as an El Nino, so at the beginning of the calendar year. In January, these are tropical sea surface temperature anomalies, so you've got warm anomalies, it's an El Nino, that then transitions into a La Nina by the end of the calendar year. So we can return to our statistical analysis and pick apart how much of these crop production failures are forced by ENSO. And using the maximum covariance analysis, at least, the vast majority of these are related to ENSO. So in the US and northeastern Brazil, West Africa, southeastern South Africa, all of these are related to ENSO force variability. Relevant critique is that this is just a statistical reconstruction. So there's a lot of work on the dynamics of ENSO and independent analyses between ENSO and crop yields in these regions. So we can look at this in light of the existing literature. And what I've done here is put crop flowering season, the approximate maize flowering season for each of these regions, And we can walk through and we can say, okay, we know that El Niños, these warm sea surface temperatures, tend to bring additional moisture into Southeast South America. That's good for maize yield anomalies, whereas it brings drought to Southeastern Africa, which causes maize failures. We know, like I said in the introduction, that these El Niños in the spring afterwards tend to lead to tropical tropospheric stabilization and drought, which leads to poor maize yields in both Western Africa and Northeastern Brazil. And in the Northern Hemisphere, there are any number of studies for looking at the effect of this La Nina, which it's transitioned to by this point, on maize yields and the climate. And the signs of these anomalies are consistent with all of the existing literature, both on the dynamics of how tropical sea surface temperatures affect the climate in these regions, and with the statistical analyses that are available to independently look at the relationship between ENSO and these crop yields. So all of that is just to say that we have confidence that this is a real result, that ENSO did force or played a large role in forcing the largest synchronous crop failure since 1960. And this didn't happen just in a composite mean. This can happen in an individual year, and it did happen in the historical record. So while ENSO may only account for about 18% of maize production variance globally, which is around a fifth, it may play an outsized role in forcing these synchronous crop failures because of its global footprint. So with that, I'll leave up some conclusions, which are essentially that ENSO might force globally synchronous crop failures because of the global footprint of its teleconnections, and that this means we need to reassess our assumptions about whether crop failures are indeed independent from region to region, at least in El Nino and La Nina years.
So we've got time for a few questions, but I did want to mention what you know and some people in the room do, that the original research that led to the understanding of ENSO was done by Gilbert Walker, who was a Brit who was sent to India after some tremendous famines when the monsoon failed. So it was about an investigation into food insecurity that started the whole thing. He called it a Southern Oscillation because it was slightly south of the equator, and it became ENSO later. Just a little historic note. So, any questions?
I can't help but want to know whether or not you make this available to the press.
Yeah, so you mean the papers that this is based on? Yeah.
Understandable by the common community.
Yeah, so right now there aren't many general public articles that this is in. There are journal articles that it's in, and those are available on my website. Otherwise, they're unfortunately behind paywalls. They're available on request, but there is a short Earth Institute blog about it, and some of these results are still in review, and so it wouldn't be appropriate to write a general public aimed article about them yet, right? Yeah, right, absolutely.
Some of the areas on your maps are light blue, and I think that means that the crop actually yield increased. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So to what extent would it have been worse without those compensating mechanisms, and would that have affected crop prices more? Is that something worth thinking about?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right that ENSO doesn't only force crop failures. It redistributes precipitation and temperature, and in some regions, an El Nino year will be better for crop production. And that's, as you point out, there's a compensating mechanism there, and that's actually really important to clarify, because for a crop like wheat, that compensating mechanism means that when we looked at these synchronous crop failures, your better production years as a result of, say, an El Nino tended to offset your poor production regions so that they roughly canceled out. Because of the distribution of maize growing regions and seasons, that wasn't true, partially because the US dominates the maize production market so much, but that's a really good point, that these aren't all of a single sign, and you need to look at both to really understand the global footprint of it.
Thanks. I think we'll move. So at the end. Okay. So hold your question until the end.